Everything Old is New Again, America's entertainment pop culture talk show.
It may well possess a rudimentary intelligence.
I'm trying to think, but nothing happens.
Felt a great disturbance in the force.
Hello, I'm Mr. Red.
Come on, bark like a dog for me.
Where's the goodies? Leave the gun. Take the cannoli.
I bet you wouldn't have done anything like this if Mom and Dad were here.
You filthy criminal.
Excuse me while I whip this out.
Go ahead. Make my day.
Here are your hosts, Douglas Viviani and David Cohen.
Whatever's in there has been safely hidden for 2,000 years. The hieroglyph said she was named Amenet, chosen to be Egypt's next queen. But her thirst for power led her down a darker path, one that had to be stopped.
Because of your actions, this ancient power has returned.
That's me, Douglas Viviani, here on Everything Old is New Again. I've returned. Unfortunately, Mr. David Cohen, our usual co-host, is unavailable today. That's okay, because we have a guest today, and I just want to take a look at what that clip was. That was a little bit from this summer's The Mummy starring Tom Cruise. I don't believe a stitch of fact is encompassed in that movie, but we will take a look at ancient Egypt based on the idea that, well, let's face it, there was a 1999 movie, The Mummy, 2001, 2008, Mummy, Tomb of the Dragon. It's inevitable that Everything Old is New Again takes a look at the old ancient civilization, Egypt itself, that truly is everything old and becoming and is and always been. People have had this fascination with Egypt for quite some time, and we'll go through that. So everything Egyptian is new again on Everything Old is New Again. This week we got a special guest who's truly going to make ancient Egypt come alive right here on your radio. Dr. Bob Brier has worked with pyramids and tombs in 15 countries, conducted research and mummification practices worldwide. In 1994, with a colleague, Ronald Wade, he mummified a human cadaver using ancient Egypt techniques which haven't been used for 2,000 years. He's now known as affectionately Mr. Mummy in some places. He's also the subject of many National Geographic television shows. He's written quite a number of books. He's done a terrific 3 series on Egypt for the Teaching Company. There's a 48 lecture history of ancient Egypt that I listened to. That, believe it or not, once you listen to this, even if you don't have too much of an interest really in the topic just yet, listen to these tapes and you'll be addicted. That's for sure. Thereafter, I listened to the Great Pharaohs of Ancient Egypt, 12 lectures, and now there's a new one, Decoding Hieroglyphs, that's out. Just go to the Teaching Company and you'll find that online. Bottom line, he's written some books also, possibly solving the murder of King Tut, possibly solving the secret of how did they build the Great Pyramid. Now Cleopatra's Needle is the latest book. We're out of time, but we will speak now next week to Dr. Brier. Doctor, thank you so much for coming on board.
Hi, Douglas. That was quite an introduction.
I figure the first show, we're going to do 2 shows together, this and next week. I figure I'll get it all out of the way this week so we can get into the... And what you're so accomplished, I mean, I just don't want to ignore the fact that you have really been involved with this for almost, I think, since 1972. Is that about the right time you started teaching at LIU?
Right. Yeah, it's about right, yeah.
And what got you started? Why ancient Egypt? Why should any of us care about anything that's, I don't know, 5,000 to 3,000, 2,000 years old?
Well, that's sort of 2 questions. What got me started, and why should we care? I got started purely by accident, Douglas. I was a basketball player. I had gotten my doctorate, but I was still playing ball in minor leagues, and I had an injury, a knee injury. And I was having operations on my legs, so ACL stuff, so I could play ball again. And somebody knew I liked languages, and while I was recovering, I had casts on my ankle to my hip, somebody gave me a copy of a hieroglyph textbook, Gardner's Ancient Egyptian Grammar, and I taught myself hieroglyphs. So for 8 hours a day, I became obsessed with hieroglyphs, and I'm drawing ducks and feet and stuff like that. And when the cast came off, I could pretty well translate hieroglyphs. So I started teaching a university course on the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs, and then my students said, Dr. Brier, we got to go to Egypt. Now, I had never been to Egypt, so I figured, this might be interesting. So I said to the kids, okay, we could do it. So we worked out a study tour. We went to Egypt, and then I figured, this is really great stuff. That's what I'm going to do for the rest of my life.
And so, I think you've done tours all the time now, right?
Yeah. Every year I take a group of students, people through Egypt, yeah. But it was an accident that got me into Egypt, and then I realized it was fabulous. And then, the second question you had was, why should we care? It's almost a little different. It's sort of, why do people care so much? I mean, everybody's fascinated with Egypt. And I think it's that Egypt's got a lot of stuff going for it that other civilizations don't. They have mummies.
Right.
They have the fabulous art. They still have the ancient temples. No other civilization has its monuments preserved so well. It's got everything going for it. So it's just a fabulous civilization.
And it's also Hollywood certainly has caught on basically from the Mummy in the 1930s, and of course the 1920s. We'll talk about King Tut's tomb being found and discovered. Sure. I think that revitalized. But also, if you go back to Napoleon back in late 1700s, he had an expedition there. So it's not new. It's something that he was totally enthralled with, and we'll talk about that. And even as you go back in time, I believe the Romans did some mummification themselves, and there's some interplay there, of course, with Cleopatra and Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. So it's you're right. Throughout history, no doubt, to me, there's so much about ancient Egypt that you don't realize. When even in our day today, there are even fashions that you'll see when people are walking around, or tattoos, or there's so many different things that exist that are in our world today from ancient Egypt. And so I would suggest, can you give us just a smidge of how do we know about, I know certainly the structures exist in the pyramids and so forth, but how do we know about this? So seems to be so much of the history. We know the different pharaohs' names, we know kind of what they did. How do we know all this stuff? Yeah, well, one of the things that we have is hieroglyphs. The Egyptians were sort of a nation of accountants. They recorded everything. And when hieroglyphs were deciphered, we could read everything. And on the temple walls, you can read how many sons Ramses the Great had. He had 100, but he had 100 kids. Kind of incredible, 100 kids. But also, we have these records. So I can tell you, for example, what they ate for breakfast. I can tell you recipes. We have medical texts. We have everything. So no civilization ever recorded as much in detail, and we have it now. So we can really find out the details. So it's a kind of civilization that can come alive again. We really can see what they were like as people, and that's one thing that it really has going for it. And how did they record this, or I should say, better way, is what did they record this on that lasts 3,000 years? Yeah, well, they had several surfaces they could record on. Of course, there's stone, and that's the best. The temples are large surfaces on which you can record your history. And every pharaoh who built a temple wanted to brag about how great he was, what battles he fought. So on the walls of the temples, when you go to Egypt and you see these fabulous scenes, but you'll also see thousands and thousands of hieroglyphs. And this is telling the wonderful exploits of the pharaoh. So stone is the first medium. The other thing is they invented papyrus, which is a vegetable fiber. It's a reed that grows by the Nile, and they would cut it into thin strips and glue it together and make paper. It's the basis of our paper. And this, in a dry country, will last forever. So we have papyri, thousands and thousands of rolls of papyri that the Egyptians wrote on. So we've got paper, we've got stone. These guys wrote on wood. They wrote on anything. If it didn't move, they wrote on it. And we're going to survive for a little while for time. Oh, boy, that's loud. On Everything Old is New again. Let me turn that down a little bit. We'll be back with Dr. Brier, continue our discussion of all things ancient Egypt. Come on back. Everything Old is New again.
You're listening to Everything Old is New Again, America's entertainment pop culture talk show with Douglas Viviani and David Cohen.
I'm sorry, I guess
You're listening to Everything Old is New Again, America's entertainment pop culture talk show with Douglas Viviani and David Cohen.
33 centuries had passed since human feet last trod the floor on which we stood, and yet the signs of recent life were around us. A half-filled bowl of mortar, a blackened lamp, the chips of wood left on the floor by a careless carpenter. So gorgeous was the sight that met our eyes. A golden effigy of the young king of magnificent workmanship filled the whole of the interior,
There we go. Everything old is new again. Back here talking about ancient Egypt with Dr. Bob Brier. And we're doing so with the help of a little clip there from Howard Carter, who on November 4th, 1922, he discovered the tomb of King Tut. Neither of us were there at the time, but I look back at the newsreels and specials and so forth. This was a phenomenon beyond the Beatles, I would say, that we could relate to.
It was like putting a man on the moon.
There you go. And so can you put us there a little bit as to, first of all, why was it so hard to find? And when they did, I mean, why was this such a phenomenon?
Yeah, well, first, Tutankhamun was a minor king. We have all the treasures, and he's probably the most famous pharaoh in the world. But up until that time, he was a minor king, hardly known in history. And his tomb had been buried under the rubble of another pharaoh's tomb. He was buried in the Valley of the Kings, where the pharaohs were buried. But another tomb had been constructed after his, and the workmen didn't want to carry the rubble away, so he dumped it right on top of Tut's tomb. So he was hidden. And Howard Carter was searching for this thing for years and years and years. And finally, as you say, November 4th, 1922, he finds it and hits pay dirt.
How did he know? I mean, was he searching specifically for King Tut? Was he searching just in general in the Valley of the Kings, or what was it all about?
No, he was looking for King Tut.
He was.
He knew that Tut was missing in action. He knew about the name. There was this king from the 18th dynasty whose name is mentioned sometimes, and his tomb hadn't been found. And he was searching specifically for King Tut. And he teamed up with a wealthy Englishman, Lord Carnarvon, who was paying the bills. And for years, they systematically searched the Valley of the Kings. Now, Carter was a really good archaeologist, and he made the first really careful map of the Valley of the Kings. So he knew what areas had been searched, and he knew what areas hadn't. And he decided systematically to search everything to bedrock. He would move every rock, every stone in the Valley of the Kings till he got the bedrock for the entire Valley of the Kings. And then he finally hit it. He found steps leading through the bedrock down into the Valley of the Kings, and that's where he found Tutankhamun's tomb.
And so I guess a better question or a different question would then be, at the time and even now, have we found every pharaoh that we believe was in that valley, or are there still some missing?
There's still some missing. Some minor people are missing, and I think they might turn up. But, the thing about Tutankhamun's tomb that shocked everybody in 1922 is that it was intact. It still had all the treasures. It hadn't been looted repeatedly. So we had never seen anything like it. And that's the first time that people realized just how wealthy the pharaohs were. I mean, remember, Tutankhamun's a boy king. He dies around the age of 18. He only rules for maybe 10 years at most. He's a child pharaoh, and somebody's ruling in his place. But, he's a pharaoh. And then this minor king is buried with all this gold, a solid gold coffin, golden shrines. It was fabulous. Nobody knew Egypt was that wealthy.
And then you see, it's black and white, but still, you get the grandeur of it. You could see he took photographs, of course, meticulously numbered everything, and then they start carrying all this stuff right out of the tomb. I mean, would they do that today? Is that the right thing to do? I don't know what.
Well, it's still the same thing. Carter's techniques aren't radically different from ours today. For example, you photograph everything as it is, so you know where everything was. The next thing you have to do, though, is not carry it out. You've got to conserve it. You've got to strengthen it. Sometimes the wooden pieces would crumble if you lifted them.
Right.
So he had a whole team of conservators, people borrowed from the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, and they were working on these to strengthen them to make sure they didn't disintegrate. Then they get carried out. And I know just the footage that you were looking at, Douglas, this great 1923 stuff, of them carrying out masks and artifacts and things like that on wooden trays. And the photographer, a guy named Harry Burton, was sent to Hollywood to learn how to work a movie camera. He was a still photographer for archaeological excavations, and Burton actually went to Hollywood to learn how to work that movie camera.
Wow, and the thing is, then I later on, of course, it toured in New York in the 1970s. They took a lot of the contents, I believe, and toured it around the country. It certainly was in New York City. It was a phenomenon when I was a child. Then back in 2007, I went to Philadelphia just to see this. It didn't come back to New York, but it that came to Philly, and they had some additional, I think you could say his dad, Akhenaten, and some other, I don't want to call it paraphernalia, but other
artifacts.
Artifacts, right, exactly. And that was, it's incredible when you go in there and you're actually standing, you can get, there's glass around it, but you could stand maybe, 2-3 feet, maybe 1 foot away from something that this king was wearing or using, the chest plate or other things, and the mummification, the mummy mask and so forth, that you could see. And you're right, you can't get that close to the President of the United States, Abe Lincoln's things. It's amazing that you're right there. So when you're in that environment, I can only imagine what it's like to discover that, or like you do, go and visit all the time. There must be an unending source of artifacts that you have seen and continue to see this way. No?
Yeah, no. It's absolutely. It's always wonderful to be in Egypt and to see artifacts. But one of the great things you can do today in Egypt, it's still possible, is you can go into Tutankhamun's tomb and you can see the paintings on the walls. But even better, you can see Tutankhamun. He was left in this tomb in the Valley of the Kings because he was the only pharaoh ever found intact in his tomb. The Egyptian Antiquity Service decided to leave him in the tomb. So Tutankhamun is in a glass case, climate-controlled, and you can actually look on the face of the boy king. So you can not only visit his tomb, you can see Tutankhamun himself. Now, that's a biggie.
That's amazing. We're going to get into that certainly down the line in terms of mummification, what you're actually looking at when you're looking at him and so forth, and how they did it. But you were just referencing a lot of the hieroglyph or the writings that are still there. Next section of the show, I'd love to take a look at it and see if you can explain just briefly how that works. But before we do, we mentioned Napoleon. We have a minute, let me see here. We've got like 2.5 minutes. I just want to, you mentioned him, and I was so surprised to hear, because you don't learn this a lot out in high school, what have you, that Napoleon had a big effect, I think, on Egyptology or the study of Egypt. No, can you explain a little bit what went on with him?
Sure. Well, Bonaparte invaded Egypt in 1798. He wanted to control Egypt, and when he invaded, he took with him, this army of 40,000 soldiers. But with him, and now Napoleon was a really cultured man. He was very intelligent. He took with him, along with his army of 40,000 soldiers, he took 150 scientists, geologists, artists, architects, mineralogists, everybody in the arts and sciences to study Egypt. He was going to win a war, he felt, and also describe all of Egypt for the rest of the world. So while he's fighting this war, which he eventually lost, you've got these 150 guys who are drawing the monuments. They're studying the plants. They're looking at the artifacts. They're excavating. And when they came back from this war, they published one of the largest publications in the history of the world, a set of more than a dozen volumes called The Description of Egypt. And it showed people for the first time what the temples really looked like. These guys were pros. They could really draw. They were great. And people just went nuts over Egypt. So Bonaparte starts this wave of Egyptomania. But also, on this expedition, they discovered the Rosetta Stone, right? Which is the key to deciphering hieroglyphs. So because of Bonaparte, people both see what Egypt really looks like, they get accurate descriptions, and for the first time, we're going to learn how to read the text. So Bonaparte really contributed a great deal to Egyptology.
Now, before he went there, did he have any inkling? What was the information, if you know, that they had before he went there about what the pyramids and what else there was? I know there was a historian in 500 BC, Herodotus.
Herodotus.
Yeah,
Herodotus. Yeah, you're right. I mean, before Bonaparte, the basic sources of what the Egyptian civilization was like were the Greeks. They wrote down, the Greeks, by the way, were Egyptomaniacs also. They loved Egypt, because, the Greeks were newcomers compared to the Egyptians. The Greeks revered Egypt because it was such an ancient civilization. So we have a tourist, you mentioned him, Herodotus, who around 500 BC goes to Egypt and writes down what he sees. And he says, Egypt has more wonders than any other nation in the world. And he wants his claim that he's, in a sense, a descendant of Egypt. He says the Greeks learned how to build in stone from the Egyptians. So before Bonaparte went, all we had were the Greek and Roman accounts of what ancient civilization was like. Now we can read it right from the Egyptian record.
And you can learn so much. It's just going to thegreatcourses.com. Any of the 3 courses that Dr. Bob Brier has performed there, they're terrific. We'll be back right here on Everything Old is New Again.
Winning one was a young man, he never thought...
Now, back to America's entertainment pop culture talk show. Everything old is new again, with Douglas Viviani and David Cohen.
Hey, it's Dr. Peter Weller. I'm here with my friends David Cohen and Douglas Viviani on Everything Old is New Again, one of my favorite shows. And I may not be the most interesting man in the world, but I'm one of them.
Well, he's one of them. We also have another one that might be a challenger to that title, Dr. Bob Brier from LIU, an Egyptologist extraordinaire. You got to check out some of the books he's got. Ancient Egypt, Everyday Life in the Land of the Nile. You've got Cleopatra's Needles. We'll talk about that next show, about the obelisks that were moved from Egypt. And there's a book that you got to read, The Murder of Tutankhamun. We just spoke about King Tut, and we'll go into that a little bit more detail next show as well as to what might have happened. And possibly we will talk about the pyramids too. But before we do, I want to get into a little bit of hieroglyphs. And let's talk about, first of all, Napoleon, as we just spoke about, discovered the Rosetta Stone in like 1798. But for all of us that are not history majors, let's say we've heard that term, and probably because it's a computer program that now is being sold with that name that you can learn different languages with, and I guess that's analogous to what they found. But what is the Rosetta Stone, and how did they find this?
Okay, the Rosetta Stone, it's a large stone. It's about, I guess it's almost 4 feet high, and it was a proclamation. It's a big stone that was set up in front of a temple by one of the pharaohs. When the Greeks were ruling Egypt, the Greeks had pharaohs too. They took over Egypt at the end, and he's basically making a proclamation. Now, the great thing about this stone is that the proclamation was written in 2 languages. It was written in ancient Egyptian and in Greek. Now, nobody could read hieroglyphs at this point. And when it's discovered, as you say, in 1798 by Napoleon's men, they were digging in, they were, I guess it would be reconstructing a fort that had been crumbling. They were trying to reinforce it. And at the foundation of the fort, this fort was at Rosetta, a city in Egypt. At Rosetta, they found this big stone that had been reused and built into the fort. And they took it out, and the soldiers immediately, the officers knew this is written in Greek and in hieroglyphs. You know, this could be the key, because they could read the Greek. And the Greek inscription said, "We have written this proclamation in the language of the priests," meaning hieroglyphs, in the language of the people, which was a more cursive way of writing hieroglyphs, and in our language, Greek. So it was the same inscription written 3 times. So they figured the Greek is going to be the key to deciphering hieroglyphs, because it's the same thing in Greek and hieroglyphs. So it took a while to decipher it. I mean, it took 20 years before Champollion finally cracks the code, but this was the key to deciphering hieroglyphs, found by Bonaparte, and it's a proclamation written in both Egyptian and Greek.
But it was like a piece of a cornerstone of a building, right? Or it wasn't like displayed?
It was built into the foundation of a fort, but originally it was a freestanding stone. It would look like a tombstone, like a very large tombstone, standing up in front of a temple with a proclamation. It's kind of like ancient Egypt's bulletin boards. When you wanted something for the people to know, you carved it on stone and put it in front of a temple.
But then think about it. Some boob used that didn't really know what it was to build this building.
Right, exactly. He used it as filler for his fort.
Which probably was one of the greatest things, I guess, because it probably, I'm guessing, preserved it. I don't know.
No, that's right. It saved it.
So it's a mistake of history, and certainly someone had the great idea to, I guess they just did it once that we found, to do this. But so then from there, you can then figure out, I guess you'd say, the alphabet of the hieroglyph, no?
Yes. What was key was this. We have the pharaoh's name written in Greek. The pharaoh's name was Ptolemy, Ptolemy, Ptolemy. And they knew that ancient Egyptian pharaohs wrote their names in cartouches, an oval, a big oval, and you'd write your name in that, and that would say you're king. And they figured that the name in the cartouche must be Ptolemy also, because they wrote it in Greek, it's Ptolemy, and they knew the same thing was written in hieroglyphs, so Ptolemy must be the name in the cartouche. And that's how they figured out the alphabet. The first hieroglyph in the cartouche was a rectangle, actually, and they figured that must be a P. And the next was a semicircle. That must be a T. The next was what looked like a lasso. That must be the O. Then came a lion. Oh, that's the L. And they went along like that, and they reconstructed the alphabet.
So I'm looking at something right here, just as a sample, an example. If you have a picture of a hand with the fingers facing to the left of you, that's the letter D, correct?
Exactly. They're not talking about a hand. See, that's what threw people off. You know, for thousands of years, well, hundreds of years at least, people believed that ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs was picture writing. That when you have a picture of a bird, they're talking about a bird. When you have a picture of a hand, they're talking about a hand. But if you think about it, it really doesn't make any sense. If that were true, then the ancient Egyptians would always be talking about birds and hands.
Right.
Also, if it really were picture writing, we could read it. So it really didn't make any sense. It was an assumption that everybody went along with, but it just didn't make any sense. So as you point out, when you see a hand, that's a letter of the alphabet. That's the way they wrote the letter D. And if you see an owl, they're not talking about an owl. They're talking about the sound as in M. It's the letter M. And when you see wavy lines for water, they're not talking about water. They're talking about N, the letter N. So it's an alphabet just like us. They spell out words, and they have words just like us.
Now, there are also words that combine some letters together to make sounds, right? Like a bird is like a sound or something like that. Is that right?
Well, some birds, there are different birds.
Right.
They have an owl, which is an M. There's a vulture, which is an A. So, for example, if we wanted to write your name, Douglas, right, which is a sound, well, we'd start with a hand. We said that's a D.
Right.
But now you need a U, right? So that's a quail chick, a little baby bird, a little fuzzy bird. So you'd have a hand, and you'd have a quail chick, and then you need a G. Well, that's a little rectangular jar stand, something you put a pot on. So that's your G. Then you come back with another quail chick because you need another U. And then, you need an S, so we might give you the S is something that looks like a cane, actually. It's bolt of folded cloth. So you'd spell out your name Douglas with these hieroglyphs, and it wouldn't be picture writing. It's words that sound like words.
Now, before they translated this, before the late 1700s, there couldn't have been that much information then that was there, but that we didn't know it much. Am I wrong to say that once the Rosetta Stone was interpreted, I guess then later on by like the 1820s, let's say, there was a floodgate of information about the civilization?
Absolutely right. And not only that, not only was there a floodgate of information, we started to realize how wrong earlier guesses were. Right. For example, there was a guy in the 17th century, Athanasius Kircher, in Rome, who was like the Pope's scientist, and he had translated the obelisks that were brought over to Rome, and he got it totally wrong. He was just making it up.
Right.
So loads of people were looking at this stuff and figuring it's kind of picture writing, so they'd be talking about this and that, and they were just wrong. And once Napoleon cracked the code, they said, oh, my God, this is really wacko.
Now, we're going to learn all about that in your course on hieroglyphs at thegreatcourses.com. The teaching company is the name of the organization, but I think they may have changed it, or at least online. You can find them on thegreatcourses.com. What do you do for I think there's, is it 12 courses, 12 classes?
Yeah. We have 12 lectures. It is basically a beginner's course in hieroglyphs, and it takes you from the very beginning. I have some lectures where I give the background. For example, there's a whole lecture on the Rosetta Stone and Napoleon's Egyptian campaign, stuff like that. Give the background history, and then I start slowly teaching the alphabet. So by the end of the third or fourth lesson, everybody can read and write his or her own name in hieroglyphs and can write any name they want. Then we learn a little vocabulary. It's just like a French or Spanish course in a way. We learn some vocabulary. We put the words together in sentences. There's even some grammatical rules. We know where the verb comes, and stuff like that. And then by the end of the course, people can actually go to the Metropolitan Museum of Art or any of the large museums. Chicago has a large collection, and translate some of the things on the walls. You're not going to be fluent, but you're going to be able to figure out what things they're saying. So it's a lot of fun. I'll tell you a funny story about this course. It's like it was one of the harder things I've ever done, trying to figure out how to present it within a few lessons and this and that. And I had my producer at the teaching company who was taking the course while I was teaching it to make sure that it made sense. So he could say to me, wait, this doesn't sound right, or I don't understand this. So it was a lot of fun trying to put it together for people, and I think they're going to like it. It's a pretty good course.
And you could become an expert compared to your friends when you visit the museum.
Your friends, yes. You'll be the best Egyptologist in the room, probably.
Maybe worth a free drink at the bar afterwards, anyway.
Absolutely. No, I think people will enjoy it. It's a funny thing. I taught hieroglyphs years ago at a school in New York called the New School for Social Research in Manhattan. It's a good school, and I taught a course in hieroglyphs, and I couldn't believe the number of people who attended the course. My first time I taught it, I had 100 people in the room wanting to learn hieroglyphs. Now, these weren't just your ordinary college students. Many of these people had already graduated from college, but they just had a fascination with hieroglyphs, and they wanted to learn it, and they were very good. So there's a lot of interest out there in hieroglyphs. It's amazing.
Absolutely. Listen, I have an 8-year-old, and she is I've kind of gotten her a little bit into this as well. It's your fault, by the way.
I take full responsibility.
Your excitement and enthusiasm really translates. Maybe she doesn't understand everything that's said in the lectures and what have you, but certainly this caught her fancy because they can grab onto the pictures and kind of, it really makes them come alive for them. So she at least doesn't memorize all that, but she's.
Does she like writing them? A lot of people find it almost therapeutic. One of the things I do in the videos to show people how to write the hieroglyphs, how to draw the birds, how to draw the feet, and people find that therapeutic. They just love drawing hieroglyphs.
Yes, and it's for a kid too that's sort of learning the language. It's natural to just say, it's like learning another language, but it's kind of fun because she loves to draw and loves to write. So
and it's a way of remembering it. Once you draw the hand, like you say, it's a letter D. You remember it's a D.
Correct. Especially it stands for the beginning of my name, so I'll never forget that. That's for sure.
Right.
All right, we'll be back on Everything Old is New again right after this with the theme of the mummy. We'll come back and we're going to talk about Cleopatra's Needles.
This is Everything Old is New Again, America's entertainment pop culture talk show with Douglas Viviani and David Cohen.
You are not pleased to see me here.
I am, great Pharaoh, but now I have important things to do.
So Ramses tells me.
Huh?
More important things than obeying my orders?
You ordered me to finish this city. There is the obelisk of your jubilee. Baka, put 1,000 slaves to removing the sand until the stone settles to its base.
There you go. A little bit of Charlton Heston there. I can't help it. The 10 Commandments, 1956. Not sure how much was... There we go. That's Moses raising an obelisk for the 10 Commandments. Charlton Heston, 1956. I can't help but just enjoy watching that now after I've taken courses from Dr. Bob Brier on thegreatcourses.com. Take a look at that. We're talking all things ancient Egypt. Right there, they're talking about raising an obelisk. That's what Moses was doing at the time in the movie. The question is with respect to obelisks first, and I guess another question is, would a builder be able to actually talk to a pharaoh that way? Two questions for you.
Yeah, well, I think the chief architect would be able to talk to the pharaoh probably. Not the average builder. You're not your construction guy who's carrying bricks, but I think the chief architect. Now, the Egyptians didn't have a word for architect. The guy who really was the chief was called the overseer of the works. So he would be the guy who could talk to the pharaoh and say, Pharaoh, here's what I intend to do. What do you think? And, would you want me to move the chair around? So yeah, you could. I think he could.
Okay. And what's an obelisk? What are they raising? I think we just to get an idea.
I'll tell you something great about obelisks. As you mentioned, Douglas, I just wrote a book about obelisks called Cleopatra's Needles on the Lost Obelisks of Egypt. I think that obelisks are the most amazing thing that the Egyptians ever constructed. Even better than the Great Pyramid of Giza, better than Tutankhamun's tomb. I think obelisks just blow me away. Now, an obelisk is a single piece of stone. They're always made out of granite. They're often about 100 feet tall, and they weigh about 350 tons. Okay, so it's a single piece of stone, 350 tons, 100 feet long, and we still don't know how they erected them. We really don't. It's one of the true mysteries. They were pounded out of a quarry. There's one quarry. They all came from the same granite quarry at Aswan, Egypt, in the south of Egypt. And granite is so hard that the Egyptians did not have metal that they could chisel them out with. They didn't have a metal hard enough. They only had either copper in the beginning or later bronze, which is much softer than granite. So they couldn't get them out that way. What they did was they took another hard stone called dolerite, and they pounded these obelisks out. They were pounded out by probably prisoners, dropping this dolerite ball that weighs about 16 pounds. It looks a little bit like a small, dense bowling ball. And they would line up along this line drawn by the overseer of the works and start pounding out this obelisk from the quarry. And, with dust flying, there would be probably somebody beating a drum to have them all dropping the ball in unison. But it was an incredible thing to pound these things out of a quarry.
And how did they then lift it to get onto and transport it?
Yeah. Now, I think this is what we think. They would move it out of the quarry on rollers, on like logs. They would tie ropes around it and haul it that's another really big deal to hold this sucker. It weighs 350 tons. That means you need probably close to 2,000 guys pulling on the rope, which is an incredible thing to coordinate 2,000 guys pulling on a rope.
With no wheels.
And it's rolling on logs. That's the best we can think.
Right.
Rolling on logs. And then you finally get it to a barge by the Nile. And putting on a barge is not an easy thing either. This thing doesn't slip off. It's on the deck. It doesn't go in the hull.
Right.
So they get it on the deck, and then they sail this thing to where it's going to be erected. Now, the problem is getting it up. How do you get it up? Now, it's on a pedestal. Obelisks stand on a pedestal. The pedestal is like a cube that's about 8 feet high. All right? It's an 8-foot-high cube, weighs 50 tons by itself. And it's just this cube. And you want it standing up, nice, square in the middle, on this pedestal. Obelisks are not pinned or glued or nailed down in any way. They're balanced. They are made so precisely that the obelisk, once you stand it up, is simply balancing like a needle right on top of the pedestal. But we don't know how they got it up. How do you get it so precisely placed on the pedestal? They never left the record, so it's one of those mysteries. But obelisks are just fabulous. There were once more than 100 in Egypt. Now there's hardly any.
Now, what was the purpose for them of the obelisk?
Obelisks almost always came in pairs. When you had one, you had two. The pharaoh would quarry 2 obelisks, and he would put them in front of the temple entrance. And on the obelisk is the pharaoh's names and titles, so that you know this pharaoh built this temple. So they're really just things to glorify the pharaoh, telling you his name, and that I, Ramses the Great, built this temple, that kind of thing.
Now, you say there's many of them, that there were many of them, now there's very little in Egypt.
Yeah, very few.
Did many of them fall? Did they just, I know after that we'll talk about, they were transported to other lands, but what happened to them eventually?
Well, one thing is, they didn't fall of their own natural accord usually. They stayed up there. They were pretty well positioned. What happened in the late part of Egyptian civilization, they were invaded by the Persians, and there was a Persian king named Cambyses who pulled down many of the obelisks. We know that. Also still later in their history, they were taken over by the Romans, and the Romans took them down and brought them back to Rome as war trophies. And to this day, Rome has more obelisks than any other city in the world, including any city in Egypt.
It's amazing. And you talk about this certainly in detail with respect to moving of the obelisk and all of what we spoke about, of course. But the question is, they then also moved them to England, France, and the U.S. We've got one in Central Park.
Yes. In the 19th century, right, in the 19th century, Egypt was basically going bankrupt. I mean, it was. And the rulers of Egypt wanted to curry favor with European powers, and they were giving away their obelisks, right? So in the first obelisk to leave Egypt was given by Muhammad Ali, who was the ruler of Egypt then, and it leaves in about 1830, right? And the French get it, and a man named Napoleon went to Egypt with a specially built boat, and put the obelisk in the hull, sailed it to Paris, and erected at the Place de la Concorde, where it is today. The next one wouldn't go out for another 40 years or so. It was 1877, I think it is, when England got their obelisk. And that obelisk is an incredible story. I mean, one of the reasons I wrote this book, Cleopatra's Needles, is that I thought the story of the 3 obelisks that left Egypt in the 19th century were amazing. The one that went to London was lost at sea. It actually, they had an interesting technique for bringing it back to England. They took their obelisk and they put it in a caisson. Now, a caisson is made out of iron, and it looks pretty much like one of these giant, a cigar tube, like the fancy cigars come in, the little metal tube.
Right.
They put it in this tube, and they had a steamship towing the obelisk in this caisson back to England. And they hit a hurricane.
Wow.
And in the middle of the hurricane, this obelisk was going to sink. I mean, the obelisk shifted in the tube. I mean, it was a real drama story. And they had to cut it loose in the hurricane. And the obelisk, is drifting away in this hurricane. And the next morning, they started to look for the obelisk. The steamer is going around and around looking for the obelisk, and they couldn't find it. They figured it sunk. So they steamed back to England. And then the next day, another ship comes along and found it. It was still afloat, and they got to keep it. The other ship, because according to the rules of the sea, it's salvage. It's yours.
That's a good day.
Yeah. So they now got this obelisk, and it had to be settled in court. the British government had to buy it back.
Wow.
Buy the obelisk back. And the question is, what's an obelisk worth? So it was an interesting court case.
And it's also interesting, I don't know if I've seen any pictures, but I know you've defined where they came to New York and there was a procession through basically the streets of New York.
Oh, yeah. That's a great story. What happened was this with the New York obelisk, another great story. The man who brought the New York obelisk back for us is named Henry Gorringe, and he was a Mason, as in the Masonic order. There aren't that many Masons anymore, but in Gorringe's day, in 1880, everybody, who was anybody, was a Mason. And his fellow Mason, Vanderbilt, agreed to pay for bringing an obelisk to New York City. So Gorringe goes over to Alexandria, Egypt, to bring back an obelisk given to the United States, but given to New York by the Khedive. And he sees this fabulous obelisk, and there's a pedestal under it, of course. It's resting on a pedestal. And as he's lowering the obelisk and he starts moving the pedestal, he finds mason's tools, like a trowel, a plumb bob, things that masons would have used. And Gorringe is convinced that this is a message from his fellow masons from ancient Egypt. Right? So he immediately feels that this obelisk and pedestal is a Masonic monument. So he brings back the pedestal also. He wasn't told even to bring back the pedestal. New York's the only one that has the original pedestal, 50 tons.
Wow.
And he brings back the obelisk, right, which is great. And when they erect the obelisk in Central Park, it's under Masonic supervision. So the Masons have this fabulous parade. You get 15,000 Masons parading up Fifth Avenue all the way from 14th Street to Central Park and 82nd Street. So it was one of these great parades up Fifth Avenue. Just an amazing event.
You'll learn all about this and more at your fingertips with Cleopatra's Needles, The Lost Obelisks of Egypt, by Bob Brier, Dr. Brier, Professor Brier, so many titles. And take a look at thegreatcourses.com. We're having a great time. We'll be back next week on Everything Old is New Again to continue talking all things ancient Egypt.